Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel and welcome back. In this video, we're going to see the differences and compare how it is to use Go when it comes to server-side rendering with Next.js. And one thing that I want to preface before we start with seeing here the pros and the cons is that Go is a language and Next.js is a front-end framework. Now, it is also doing back-end stuff, I guess. But my point here is that this is not a sort of competition or a war. I'm not trying to sort of score points on the Go side, which I prefer to use to build my projects when compared to Next.js. What I simply want to do here is I want to sort of let you know what the pros and cons for each one of these solutions would be. So if you are thinking of building a web application and you're thinking of using Go, with that also comes a lot of different tools inside of the Go ecosystem. So you can pick different templating languages or templating engines. You can pick also different routing packages. So for example, the She router is my favorite. And then on the Next.js side, it is more of a built-in solution. So they provide the routing already. They provide the templating engine, which is JSX. So I want to sort of preface this entire video by letting you know that this is not a sort of comparison in the way of what's better, what's the thing that you should use. That should always be your own decision, and you should always make your own research and see what the pros and cons for each one of these things might be. So with this being said, let's take a look first of all at the Go side and the pros of building a web application that's server-side rendered with Go. The first pro is that it gives us better control when building our web application in comparison to Next.js. And that's because we get to pick all of the pieces of our web application. And not only is this true because, again, Go is a language and Next.js is a framework, but I would also say that in a Go ecosystem, there's more of the habit of simply building small packages for things that are more complex than what the average developer would be able to build. And then developers have more of the habit of building things themselves instead of relying on third-party packages for everything. And that's more true on the JavaScript side. First of all, also because I would say that a lot of JavaScript developers are more on the beginner side, and when developers start learning Go, they already have a better understanding of how to build web applications, so they also have that ability to sort of build things themselves and have a better control of how things work. But in general, in the Go side of things, you have better control, and also because since Next.js is a framework, we are sort of at the mercy of the framework creators to change things that we don't like inside of the framework. And one good example that I can give of this is that recently we had sort of a issue with caching when it comes to Next.js. And I know that a lot of people were not happy with the way that the Next.js team implemented caching in one of the recent versions. And that's not really an issue on the Go side because, again, we implement everything ourselves, including caching. We can set all of those caching rules ourselves. And as a result, it gives us more control. It is also true that it takes more work, but I think this is again this is also sort of related to my point at the beginning of the video. It is up to us as web developers to sort of see these pros and cons and make a choice of what to use inside our web applications. Then we have better performance, and I think this is one of the clearest points here, is that Go is much more performant than JavaScript or TypeScript. And because of that, when we build web applications with Go, we get much faster response times in general. If the developer doesn't do a good implementation, obviously we could have a web application that does not work correctly or is not as fast as a Next.js application. But in general, Go is much faster when it comes to processing power. So when it comes to essentially running our code, and as a result, when we make requests to sort of server-side render a page, we get a much faster response than we get with Next.js. Then we have a better error handling, and this is also sort of a pro of Go over JavaScript and not only Next.js. But in Go, we get a very correct web application. We get to see exactly at what points a function that we are calling might return an error, and we get the ability to handle that error. We can also choose to ignore it, but we have that information, which is one of the most important things, to know where things can return an error, and this is a very big pro of using Go over Next.js, and I would even say over different server-side rendered frameworks in the JavaScript ecosystem. Then we have an easier deployment, and this one might be a bit controversial because Next.js has Vercel, and we can choose to use Vercel to deploy our web applications, but the fact is that it is not really a pro of Next.js, it is more of a pro of Vercel itself. If we choose to use Next.js, for example, or Svelte, it is also very simple and easy to deploy to Vercel. But in the Go side of things, it is very, very easy to build a Docker file and then do the deployment that way and upload that Docker file to many different service providers that can host our web application. And it is very easy to sort of have that Docker file with all of the things that we need to build before deploying our web application, and sort of be able to move from different service providers and even host our own VPS without really having to do any sort of change to the way that we are deploying things. And then we have the portability, which sort of ties in with the previous point, but Go is a very portable language. We get the ability to compile, which makes it faster, but we also get the ability to compile it for different platforms. Like if we are using macOS, we can compile a binary for Linux and simply send it to our web server, or we can again choose to use Docker to be able to do all those things. But this is also one of the pros here when compared to Next.js, and that's because with Next.js we need to do a lot of steps before doing the deployment. So for example, one of my earlier videos in this channel was how to deploy a Next.js web application to a VPS with DigitalOcean. And that video was very long because there are a lot of steps to getting that done when compared to Go, which is much easier when it comes to the deployment. Now let's take a look at the cons of using Go to build a server-side rendered web application. And the first con is that it is a much more verbose language. So to be honest, I don't even like to look at Go code, but I don't really think that's a fair point to make, because the code is not supposed to be beautiful, but instead it is supposed to make our lives as developers easier and help us build better web applications. And I think that verbosity sometimes comes with that. So when the language is more verbose, it is also more explicit, and we see exactly what's happening inside our program. So this also ties into the error handling point that we previously covered. And when we take a look at a handler, for example, which is sort of a controller in the Go ecosystem, we see a lot of if error occurs, then we want to return something, and then we call another function and we get back an error, then we need to handle that error again, and it makes our handlers or our functions that handle a request very very verbose or very dense with a lot of code. But it also means that we are handling everything, and it is very easy to later read that code and understand exactly what's happening. So to be honest, this is a con in a way because the language is more verbose, so we have more work to do, but it could also be seen as a pro, again depending on your perspective, and this is something that you should first of all try, see how you like Go when compared to the JavaScript ecosystem, and in this case Next.js, and sort of see how you feel when it comes to implementing web application in both ecosystems. And then the last con, and the second one, is that it is a less mature front-end UI ecosystem. So Go doesn't really have a very mature UI ecosystem. So we have Temple, which is a great project that I use in all of my Grow web applications. And besides that, we don't really have another good templating engine in the Go ecosystem, at least from my perspective, because Temple provides us with the ability to have Go code inside of a template, and that also means that we have the type safety that comes with Go. One thing to keep in mind is that Go provides us with its own templating engine, but it doesn't provide us with any sort of type safety, and it doesn't really have a lot of good use cases when it comes to building web applications. So this is something to keep in mind. We can use Tailwind CSS with a Go and, for example, HTMX implementation and Temple, and then we can choose to use something like Daisy UI and sort of build our UIs in that way. But in the side of Next.js, because of React, we have a much more robust ecosystem when it comes to the UIs and the front end in general, and this means that you get a lot of components already built for you. You get a lot of the accessibility already taken care of for you, which means that you can move faster in the back end and not really have to think about those UI things or even have to sort of build them from scratch, I would say. Okay, so now with all of this said on the Go side, let's move here to the Next.js side. And the first pro is that it is a much more mature front-end UI ecosystem, like I said. So I would say that React is the most mature UI ecosystem that we have available in the web development world, period. So even when compared to something like Svelte or Vue.js, React is the best one when it comes to the front end. So if you don't really like to build UIs, or I would even say if UIs are a very important part of your web application, if the UI is, I would say, most of the value that your end users take from your web application, then I would say it is important to focus on the UI, and as a result you might choose to use Next.js, or you might just feel that you prefer to do all the implementation on the Go side, and that would also be a good path to take. Next, we have the better UI ergonomics, and this is a bit related to the previous point, but this is more on the developer experience side. So like I said, we have Temple on the Go side, and we have JSX on the Next.js side, and the ergonomics of building UIs, even if you choose to build them from scratch. So this is related to the previous point, but not directly, because even if you choose to build everything from scratch, you have better ergonomics when it comes to building UIs, because you have the state of you, for example, a drop down right next to the HTML, and on the Temple side you would need to use something along with Temple. For example, you could have a drop down, and then for the interactivity you could use Alpine.js, or you could use vanilla JavaScript, but you wouldn't really have such a good developer experience only when it comes to the UI side of things. So I think this is a great pro of using Next.js if the UI is something that is important to you. And then we have the next point, and that is that it is easier to integrate with dev software providers like Auth0, Supabase, and other software providers that provide services to developers. So this is a great pro of Next.js if you don't really want to think about some aspects of your web application and you prefer to give them to a third-party company and let them handle those parts of your web application. So good examples of these are authentication, first of all, because most web developers either are afraid of building authentication themselves, they don't know how to build authentication for their web application, so they prefer to use something like Auth0 and call it a day, and then simply integrate that into their tech stack. And for this use case, so if you're the kind of web developer that doesn't really like to implement these kinds of things from scratch, which I think is a great exercise at the very least for you to become a better web developer. And I think that most web developers that say that they do not know how to implement these things, they actually have the ability to do that, and they could learn how to implement authentication because it is not rocket science. But a lot of web developers still choose to not focus on that because they want to move fast, they want to build stuff, and they don't really want to think about how everything works. And if that's your case, then this is a great point because like I was saying, so authentication is one of the most common use cases for this type of integration with third-party companies that provide services to web developers. Then we also have Supabase, which sort of gives us more functionality alongside that authentication part of things. We also have a sort of an entire database available to us, and then that database can have different kind of authorization levels on the rows of our database, and it gives us also real-time updates that we might want to implement inside of our web application. So Supabase in this case provides us with a lot of functionality, and the sort of the wrappers that they create for different sort of frameworks are much more robust when it comes to Next.js, maybe because they have a lot more users that use Next.js, and because of that they provide a better integration with the framework. But it is simply a fact that all of these software providers that give devs services, they have much better integration with Next.js in comparison with Go and even with other frameworks. Then we get to the cons, which the first one is a constant updates to the ecosystem and a lot of what I think is wheel spinning. So in the Next.js ecosystem, we have constant updates being done to the framework, and we have constant changes in the way of doing things. And the reason that I say that this is a lot of wheel spinning is because it seems like the ecosystem is always trying to innovate things, but the ecosystem ends up in the same place. So if we think of our end goal, which is to build a web application that gives a good experience to our end users, the reality is that most of the recent changes, I would say, that Next.js implemented into the framework are not really necessary. They are more things that I think us as web developers think are important, but they end up not being that important to users in the end. So one example of this is the fact that Next.js introduced the React components into the ecosystem, and I think that creates a lot of complexity that does not really give a lot more value to the end users. and I don't even think that those recent changes even provide good ergonomics when it comes to building web applications. They only make things more complex, and we can see these sort of changes constantly happening in the Next.js ecosystem over the years, and also in the React ecosystem only. And since I became a web developer and I started to learn about the JavaScript ecosystem and about Next.js more specifically, I saw a lot of different paradigm shifts, a lot of ways of doing things, and a lot of times where I heard that this is the new way, this is the best way, and a few months later or a couple of years later, then something new would get introduced. And I don't think that's really a positive point all of the time. It could mean that the framework is moving forward and it is actually improving in some aspects, but like I said, I feel a lot of this is wheel spinning and we are getting back to the same point, and then innovating with new solutions. Then we find problems that we didn't have in the first place, then we need to find new solutions for those problems, and we are sort of fixing our own problems all the time instead of actually trying to see what's good for the end user and for building web applications. And the next con is that it gives us higher levels of abstractions, which are much harder to debug and work with when we are managing actual projects. Now, this might look very nice when we are building toy applications and we don't need to do a lot of things to get to a point where our web application works, but when we want to actually debug something and when we start to build complex web applications that have many moving parts, then these higher levels of abstractions cause a lot of problems. And this sort of ties into the Go side of things, where we mentioned that we have better control on the Go side of things, and that's because Go doesn't have a lot of higher level abstractions over building web applications. We sort of need to do everything manually, implement everything ourselves, and while that might seem like a lot of work at the beginning of a project, when we start something new from scratch, later we are going to get a lot of value from that, because we get to see exactly how we implemented things and we get to change them, and we are not at the mercy of the framework creators releasing an update to fix something. We can change our code base ourselves and fix things. And I think this is a big con of Next.js, and that is that it has higher levels of abstractions over things, which I usually don't like when working with bigger projects. Okay, so this is it. These are the pros and cons of using Go and Next.js to build server-side rendered web applications. And again, like I said at the beginning of the video, please don't start a war over this. This is not a way of me trying to score points for Go or for Next.js. I'm simply trying to compare two different solutions. I like web development. I find it very interesting, and I like looking at these pros and cons and seeing how different solutions might be better for different web developers, for different projects, for different use cases, and that kind of stuff. And also, before I finish the video, I want to let you know that I've recently opened new spots for the HTMX and Go SaaS blueprint. So if you want to learn how to build web applications using HTMX, Go, and Temple, also Tailwind CSS, and a bunch of other web technologies, then go to webdevfuel.com/HGSB, or I'm also going to leave a link in the description down below so you can get access to it. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next video.